Annie was a 25-year-old journalist who had built her reputation on a single, unwavering rule: every haunting has a rational explanation. She spent her career traveling to the world's most infamous sites to strip away their legends using logic and forensic observation. Her latest target was the Langham Hotel in London, a landmark of Victorian luxury that has hosted royalty and celebrities for over a century. The hotel's reputation is shadowed by the story of Room 333. Many years ago, a doctor and his wife arrived here to celebrate their honeymoon, but the celebration ended in a spree of inexplicable violence. Inside the room, the doctor murdered his new wife and then turned the weapon on himself. Since that night, guests have reported a figure in Victorian dress pacing the floor of Room 333. The room remains a frozen piece of history, where the heavy furniture and layout are nearly identical to the night of the murder. To Annie, these stories were just layers of folklore built on top of old architecture. She intended to spend one night in the room, document the lack of activity, and dismantle the legend of Room 333 with a final, evidence-based report. The first sign of friction wasn't a ghost, but a reaction. When Annie confirmed her reservation, the receptionist's practiced smile went completely rigid. For a moment, her hands stopped moving across the desk. Instead of the standard plastic key card Annie expected, the staff produced a heavy, antiquated metal key, its weight a physical reminder of the building's age. The third floor of the hotel was unnaturally silent. When Annie reached the corner and grasped the brass handle of her door, the metal felt like burning cold against her palm. Once inside, she systematically turned the bedroom into a laboratory. She deployed a tripod, a high-definition camera, a directional microphone, and a laptop to monitor the room's inputs in real time. For Annie, these devices created a barrier between her and the room's history. As long as the sensors were recording, she believed she was in total control of the environment. Annie fell asleep on the sofa, only to be startled awake by a sharp knock. A muffled voice announced room service, an order Annie hadn't placed. Thinking it was a mistake, she opened the door to find a butler in the hall. He lifted the silver cloche from his tray to reveal a plate holding her own head, eyes sealed shut. Annie gasped and squeezed her eyes shut. When she forced them open a second later, the butler had vanished. The hallway was completely empty, with no sound of retreating footsteps. She slammed the door and rushed to her digital workstation, desperate to review the footage and see the physical person who just stood in the hallway. She found herself standing in a heavy silence, waiting for her equipment to provide a rational explanation for what her eyes had just seen. When she hit playback, the camera screen began to flicker with digital noise. A red warning appeared across the display. The SD card was corrupted. She checked the audio recorder. The levels had stayed flat throughout the encounter. There was no knock and no voice recorded, only the sudden sound of Annie's own scream. It was 1 a.m., and despite the fire she had lit earlier, the temperature in the room began to fall so sharply that her breath became visible. Seeking to clear her head, Annie went to the bathroom to splash water on her face. As she looked up, she saw a figure standing directly behind her in the mirror, a man in a tattered Victorian suit with graying, rotted skin. The figure reached out with long, yellowed fingernails, his hands moving toward Annie's throat in a precise mechanical echo of the historical murder. Annie was now standing in a space where her tools could no longer verify her reality, leaving her alone with an experience she could neither record nor explain away. Annie spun around to find the bathroom empty, but she didn't wait for a second look. She threw her gear into her bags, focused only on leaving room 333 immediately. She gripped the heavy wooden door handle and pulled with her entire weight, but the mechanism would not budge. She was locked inside. As the overhead lights began to strobe and flicker, the figure of the doctor reappeared, pacing slowly toward her. Annie began to scream for help, her voice raw with panic. Those screams finally broke through the heavy walls of the third floor, drawing the attention of hotel staff who began to run toward her room. The physical space of the room had narrowed to a point where Annie's only remaining connection to the outside world was the sound of her own voice. When the staff finally forced the heavy door open, the room was quiet. There was no Victorian figure and no sign of an intruder. They found Annie alone in the bathroom. She was leaning over the sink, throwing her head forward into the jagged, broken mirror. A review of the trauma reveals a chilling connection. On the left are the original police records from the murder of the doctor's wife. On the right are Annie's injuries. The angle of impact and the mechanical pattern of the wounds are identical. The staff managed to restrain her, but the damage was done. While Annie's physical wounds eventually healed, her career as a debunker ended that night. In room 333, logic proved to be a hollow defense. When a skeptic attempts to dismantle a tragedy of this scale, they risk being absorbed by the very history they tried to disprove.